About a year ago, my company got approached to do some surveying. It's mostly boundary surveying for what I call a large institutional landowner here in Central California. It was actually a cattle ranch, so they owned quite a bit of land out in what we call the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And we were approached by a technology vendor that was working with the family that owned the cattle ranch. And what they were trying to do was put in some communication infrastructure, kind of facilitate this Internet of Things type of system on the ranch. And so we got approached because as part of the permitting process that they needed to go through with the county, they needed to make sure that this infrastructure, fell within the appropriate right-of-way and easements, and that, that they didn't put expensive structures across property lines, that kind of thing. So we got approached by this vendor about doing a couple boundary surveys to facilitate that permitting requirement. And they approached us because the technology vendor was a local company, and we're a local land surveyor, and so they approached us about coming on board with them to help them meet this permit requirement with a boundary survey, and so they can build out the infrastructure that the ranch family wanted to have. And this was not a small cattle ranch. It was thousands of acres. I don't remember the exact amount, but it was big. So it was, I don't know if it was 15 separate land parcels or 20 individual land parcels, adjacent land parcels, but it was a big ranch out in the Delta. So we got into, we had some conversations with the technology vendor, and we did a little bit of basic research just to see what we might be getting ourselves into. And one of the things we discovered as part of that initial research is that this family, over the course of 75 years probably, had kind of piecemeal surveyed parts of this ranch. And I don't remember how many boundary surveys we found. It was somewhere between 10 and 15. Let's call it a dozen or 13 individual boundary surveys. And so, they came in 1970 and they surveyed these two parcels on the ranch over here because they were doing something over there. And then, in 1982, they came in and they surveyed this parcel down here on the other part of the ranch because they were doing something down there. So they just kind of piecemeal surveyed this ranch. Now, the whole ranch hadn't been surveyed, but, I say a third of the ranch had been surveyed at different periods at different times over that 75-year period. And one of the challenges that we realized we were going to have working on this project was that these 13 surveys had been done at different times by different land surveyors, and nobody had ever done any kind of comprehensive survey work to tie all these individual surveys together, to put them on what we surveyors would call a common reference frame or a common project coordinate system. And so that meant that we really had no way to get these surveys to fit together unless we went out and resurveyed all the physical monuments or marks that had been set as part of that process. And we were more than willing to do that, but that was expensive. And we got into some conversations with the technology vendor and the family that owned the ranch, and we talked about some ballpark pricing. And they were confused and upset. They said, we've had a third of the ranch surveyed already. Why are you charging us to resurvey it? Why is this so expensive? And so we tried to explain, what we're talking about in today's video, that we had to go resurvey some of that previous work because it just hadn't been tied together, and it was piecemeal, and some of it was old. And to make a long story short, we ended up not being able to work on the project. They weren't happy with our prices, and we weren't going to half-bake some kind of solution for them. So why are we talking about? Why did I tell you that story? And what does it teach us? If you're an institutional landowner or someone that works for an institutional landowner, what I call a real estate manager, what does this story teach us? What are the lessons? Okay, so before I do that, let me just define a couple terms that we're going to talk about. So I mentioned one already. That's It's an institutional landowner. So what is an institutional landowner? That's an organization that owns multiple parcels of land. They typically, we're talking about a large land area, tens of acres or hundreds of acres or thousands of acres, and they're typically they're a long-term tenant or user of the land. So they're not. It's not like a speculator or real estate land developer that's coming in and just holding the land over a short period of time. And institutional landowners is like a college or university or a hospital or a government agency. They own a lot of land and they're going to hold that land for the long term. So that's what I call an institutional landowner. Okay, what about when you hear me say unrelated boundary surveys? In this discussion, what am I talking about? What does that mean? So I'll give you a definition. Those are boundary surveys that can't be accurately located together or related to one another in a common coordinate system or reference frame without the performance of some additional field surveys. And the reason that part of the definition is important is field surveys are expensive. Right? So there has to be some resurveying or some rework to do if you have unrelated boundary surveys. So what's the basic problem that we're dealing with here, that this story about the cattle ranch illustrates? And I want to just, on a side note here, I just want to let you know, I see this pattern occur over and over again. We get approached by an institutional landowner, they've had some surveys in the past, and then they don't understand why I'm asking to get paid to resurvey some of the work that's already been done. And it has to do with this problem. So what's the basic problem? The basic problem is that land parcels don't exist in isolation, right? They touch one another, they're related to one another, they touch their neighbors. Boundaries are not always certain. A lot of lay people don't understand that there can be uncertainty in land boundaries, and the way those surveys relate to one another and potentially conflict with one another has some bearing, to use a pun on words, has some bearing on the amount of uncertainty in the line location. And in order to be properly compared and analyzed, which is part of what we do as surveyors when we go through a boundary survey, those previous historic surveys have to be on a common reference frame, or we aren't able to do that, and that's an important part of our process. So how does this problem happen? Given the challenges, given that it's expensive to resurvey monuments, given how expensive surveys are in the first place, why do we see this problem? Why don't institutional landowners have a system in place to put their boundary surveys on a common reference frame? And I got three basic reasons this happens. One is it's just short-term thinking. I don't think it's on purpose. People are thinking about the immediate project need. They're not thinking about the next project or the project 5 years from now or the project 10 years from now. So they're not taking a systems approach or an overall approach. They're thinking short-term. Second reason is they're selecting their boundary surveys based on low bid. Your low bid land surveyor, boundary surveyor is not going to be looking at the big picture. They're not going to be looking out for your long-term interests. And then the third reason is, someone either at the organization that is the institutional landowner, or, someone at the design team that they're hiring is being incompetent or negligent or ignorant. Could be all three of those. It could be negligent, they could be ignorant, or they could be incompetent. They could be all three at once. And so people don't think about this until it's too late, right? And they have all this historical boundary survey information that, has lost a lot of its value because it's not on a common reference frame. So what are the consequences of this problem? If you're an institutional landowner and you're in this situation, what's the consequence? I am not making this up. I just heard from a surveyor this past week that works at a large institutional landowner and reached out to us about getting some help because he has 100 years of boundary survey records that aren't on a common reference frame, and he's trying to figure out what to do about that. So the best case scenario is you're going to have to do some rework. You're going to have to go out and you're going to have to resurvey monuments that were set on those old surveys so that you can tie everything together. That's expensive. Field surveys are expensive. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is you might not be able to accurately recover or relate some of those historic surveys to the current surveys that you want to do. And in that case, some of that data is going to be lost forever, and that may create boundary uncertainty and land, clouds on title, land title problems. that are very expensive to resolve. So it can cause major problems in the worst case scenario. Don't do this if you're an institutional landowner. So before you pay for the next boundary survey on your land holdings, work with a good land surveyor. Find a good qualified land surveyor, build a relationship with them, and talk to that land surveyor about how you avoid this problem and retain the value in your boundary surveys for the long term, right? And it doesn't have to be outrageously expensive, and you don't have to do it all at once. So have a conversation with a qualified surveyor about that. I'll try and remember to talk about that in a future video. Now you know why you don't want to have 13 unrelated boundary surveys on your cattle ranch, right? That's expensive. It causes problems when you want to implement infrastructure or do other things with your real estate.